Who would have thought that Eisav had so much spiritual potential, and although he wrecked himself spiritually, he left us with a lesson of two modes of how we are to serve Hashem, the Yaakov model and the Eisav model, as we're going to see on a medrash commenting on this week's parasha. Because of quoting the pasuk that says Vayigdalu Hane'arim, that the boys grew up, Yaakov and Eisav, Eisav Yalkut Shimoni, the medrash Yalkut Shimoni tells us Veisav Hayu Bichlal, Eisav is included in this growth, which, as we'll see, is spiritual growth. Ela Shekilka b'Maisav, but unfortunately then he corrupted himself through his choices. In other words, the expression over here, and they grow up, meant not only that they grew in stature or in age, but that they grew spiritually. As the Medrash there says, when we speak about the person who is Godel, who is great amongst the giants, it's referring to Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, who are called great, to illustrate their spirituality. And Eisav also was on his path to greatness, but yet we find subsequently that Eisav does not emerge as a giant of spirituality, but to the contrary, he becomes a very wicked person. That's because he made poor choices and he chose toxic behavior. It's not only the Medrash, the Zohar says the same thing. That when it says the boys grew up, it meant spiritually. Look at how the Zohar says it. The side of Avram Avinu influenced them that they should grow, and his merits assisted them. Who have a mechanech mitzvahs. Avram Avinu educated them to follow mitzvahs, Yaakov Eisav, and to emerge as these powerful individuals, Yaakov and Eisav. And there the Zohar is speaking about Esav's greatness, spiritual greatness, in even more specific terms than the Medrash was. Because the Medrash might have just been saying, potentially he could have been great. We could have squeezed our way to explaining that the Medrash is saying, when it says that Eisav grew, we don't mean that he actually developed spiritually, just that he had the potential of eventually becoming a great spiritual person. But he made the wrong choices and went down the other path. Now the Zohar doesn't leave any room for that kind of doubt. The Zohar says clearly that when it says that Yaakov and Eisav grew, it meant spiritually. Which means that they actually did mitzvahs. Avraham Avinu educated them to do mitzvahs. In which case, we really have to understand this. How do we reconcile that with what we know about Eisav? How could we suggest that Eisav in and of himself was destined to become a spiritual giant? We say not only that, but that he actually reached that point to some degree at some point in his life. But then after that, the wheels came off and he corrupted himself. How can you say that? Go back to the pasuk that describes when they were in utero, where the pasuk says, that there was conflict between the children inside Rivka. Amru Chazal explained about Dvarim Huva b'Zohar Atzmoi, and the Zohar quotes it. Straight after telling us that Eisav developed spiritually. We see that what was Esav's attitude, that whenever there was Avodah Zarah around, he was urging to get out of the womb to be able to participate in Avodah Zarah. How can you reconcile the man who as a baby, even before he's born, is chasing Avodah Zarah with the person who grows up and becomes great in spirituality? Yes, so okay, and here's another piece of evidence that really flies in the face of what we've just said. Because straight after it tells us that the boys grew up, it says, the pasuk continues, Eisav becomes a hunter, which is also euphemistic for a murderer. In other words, the maturation of Eisav expressed itself as as a hunter and a murderer. So how could you suggest then that to grow up in the pasuk actually means to grow spiritually and to achieve a spiritual stature? Okay, so now maybe the best way to express this is what happens in the womb stays in the womb. As we know, the Gemara tells us that while the baby is developing in the uterus, we teach that baby the entire Torah. When the baby enters this world, then a malach comes and knocks it on its lip and causes it to forget the entire Torah. And the reason that we have to have this is because let's say that a child entered this world not having forgotten the whole Torah, then that'd be the end of free choice because you'd know everything that you need to know. The Eibush designed a world where there has to be the possibility of life and the opposite, good and the opposite. But if they have to be equally accessible, and if you have all the information of Torah when you're born, that's not really free choice. So let's say the same kind of thing happened to Eisav. That when Eisav was born, this preoccupation with chasing Avodah Zarah, he forgot it. So he could also have free choice. Maybe that's the explanation. And therefore, when he was exposed to Avraham Avinu, who educated him as a grandfather, that would have had tremendous impact on him. Maybe that's the explanation. But it doesn't really address our issue. Because the fact is that Eisav's behavior, while he was still a fetus, influenced him through his life. That he was always predisposed to Avodah Zarah. That's why when he became older, he did chase after and adopt Avodah Zarah. The Zohar says it clearly. The fact that as an adult or as an older person he chased after Avodah Zarah, says the Zohar, Nigrima begin kach was a direct result that was the place that he saw himself aligned with even while he was a baby, even as he was a fetus chasing after Avodah Zarah. So it's not good enough to say what happened in the fetus had no influence on the rest of his life, because that appears not to be the case. And by the way, that's not entirely different to the idea of forgetting the Torah. Well, while we forget it, it still leaves an impact. The whole objective of teaching a child the Torah before it's born is that the child should have a predisposition to Torah. Even if at the point of birth the child is going to forget the whole Torah. Because the fact is that the child, having been exposed to this Torah while developing as a fetus, is going to influence the child as it grows up, and the same kind of thing must have happened to Eisav, in which case, our original question stands. Eisav, who is predisposed to Avodah Zarah, who the Zohar says begin kach, that's why he lands up serving Avodah Zarah, who is immediately described as a hunter/murderer, that is somebody who grew spiritually as well? Doesn't make sense. So, in order to understand that, we're going to look at another interpretation of the conflict that occurred within Rivka's womb, and understand that there was a conflict over here between the two worlds. Chazal give another explanation about the wrestling match that's going on between Yaakov and Eisav while they're in the womb. That they were arguing or fighting over who should inherit the two worlds, this world and the next. But Tomo, which is really strange. Why would Eisav care about Olam Haba? And if he doesn't care about Olam Haba, what are they even arguing about? You take this, I'll take that. That's what I care about, that's what you care about. Eisav cared about physical material things, and that's what he wanted, Olam Hazeh. And Yaakov cared about spiritual, eternal things, and that's what he wanted. So why on earth are they fighting? It's just divided very simply. Unless, of course, you have to conclude guess what? Eisav, as much of a rogue as he was not purely concerned with this world. And Yaakov, as spiritual as he was not solely concerned with the next world. Each one of them wanted to have the benefit of both worlds. Which raises the big question, why would Eisav care about Olam Haba? Why is that even on his agenda? This is a rogue, this is an idolater, this is a philanderer, this is a murderer. What does he care about Olam Haba? So in order to understand that, let's ask a bigger question. Considering who Eisav's parents are, the question is, how does he become Eisav as a fetus? Maybe Eisav as an adult, you can make any choice you wish. But as a fetus, when he's still part of that holy environment, how does he behave this way? Let's revisit the first quotation we had about Vayisroitzitzu. That even as a fetus, Eisav is already chasing Avodah Zarah, which is a bizarre thought. Ha'avois hein amer kava l'rotzen ha'elyon, as we know, Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov are like a chariot, a vehicle for divine will. Whatever the Eibishter wants automatically happens through them. Or Kabir Rabbi Azakim Betanya, as Alter Rebbe explains in Tanya, Shakol Evrem Kulam, that every part of their body, every piece of their anatomy, was a vehicle only for what the Eibishter wanted and nothing else. So that's why Avraham Avinu's hand wouldn't move when it was time to Shech Yitzchak, because the Eibishter actually didn't want him to Shech Yitzchak. So it's Vayishlach Yodai. So if they are absolute vehicles for godliness, totally transparent, that the Eibishter shines through them, then it has to be that their children are born in the most pristine holiness possible. Which means that their children obviously had their potential, and not only that, their essence. So how then is it possible that Eisav should be born with a natural inclination to Avodah Zarah? If he makes choices, those are choices, but a natural inclination to come out of Yitzchak with a natural inclination to something so toxic? The fact that Eisav, as a developed, mature individual, chooses to be a Rasha, no question about that. Because he made terrible, corrupted decisions. Every person has free choice. And Eisav was influenced by surroundings, the Canaanites amongst whom they lived. He had interactions with Nimrod, etc. And that led him to make choices which are toxic choices. But those are his actions. That was his choice to make bad decisions. That has nothing to do with Yitzchak's input or influence. That's why we describe Eisav as having departed from Yitzchak, disassociated from Yitzchak. He stepped out of the environment that is Yitzchak's environment. And yet here the Torah is suggesting that even before he is born, before he has the capacity to make choices, before he has detached himself from the spiritual legacy and power of Yitzchak and Rivka, he's already being attracted and magnetized to Avodah Zarah. And it's so much part of his reality that the Zohar says later on, when he chose to serve Avodah Zarah, it's actually because as a child he already had this predisposition to Avodah Zarah. How could that come from Yitzchak? Well, the answer to that is everything that happens to the Avos is not only a template, but also an empowerment for how we serve the Eibishter. And serving the Eibishter is not always about living in an environment of complete holiness. We understand that the stories of the forefathers are indicators for their children. We understand that means that their stories became the tools and the resources that empower us to be able to continue our spiritual journey. Which means all the variations of how we, the children and descendants of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, come to serve the Eibishter, all originate, at least as a signal, a sign, they all originate in the stories of the Avos. Now, if you had to take the whole spectrum of how we serve the Eibishter, we could actually split it into two categories. The Rambam defines two ways that we serve the Eibishter. There's the person who is pious and elevated, who by nature is only drawn to things which are wholesome and holy. And the other kind is the person who battles with and eventually overcomes the Yetzer Hara, who is naturally inclined to inappropriate behavior but overcomes that inclination. Now, you've got to ask yourself, how does the latter come from Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, who are a Merkava? If Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov are purely vehicles, transparent manifestations of godliness in the world, where in their world do you have the experience of Kovish Sitzrei? They never had a Yetzer Hara. It's not possible that they should have a Yetzer Hara. So how could they ever express the idea of overcoming a Yetzer Hara, which would then become our resource? It's not only that. When we're speaking about somebody who overcomes the Yetzer Hara, at least they avoid acting on what the Yetzer Hara wants because they're able to conquer the Yetzer Hara. That means that the person has inappropriate desires but manages them. They only do what is appropriate. But we know that part and parcel of being Jewish and having a relationship with Hashem is also to do tshuva, which is to correct bad choices, bad behaviors, not just the predisposition or the attraction to bad behaviors. So where's teshuva part and parcel of the reality of how Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov served the Eibishter? And therefore, how do we have a resource for teshuva in our world because of the experience of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, who surely never had to grapple with the concept of teshuva? Okay, so we'd say, well, they did have challenges. They may not have been internal challenges, there were external challenges, and they overcame those, and maybe that's what gives us the capacity to overcome our internal challenges. Maybe we could have answered, despite the fact that we know for sure the others were not plagued by the kind of temptations and distractions that we have to grapple with and overcome. But we do know that externally there were factors that came into their lives that were a distraction or a barrier to their spiritual progress. From the Canaanim who were around them, or from Paroi, etc. And they had to conquer and overcome those external factors. Which means that their avodah was in fact in two different categories. On the one hand, Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov have a way of serving the Eibishter, which is growth spiritually at all times from rung to rung. And as well as an avodah, which is to overcome the external pressures that come into their world, like a Nimrod or a Paroi or whoever it might be, that they have to overcome in order to serve the Eibishter. And that's what empowers us to be able to do what the Eibishter wants, even when we have our internal distractions, because Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov are able to overcome their external distractions. Okay, great explanation, but not sufficient. It's not a clear enough explanation because, let's be honest, in many respects, it is so much more difficult to overcome internal struggles than to overcome an enemy who you could say, I'm not going to give in to this enemy. So if all Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov had to ever overcome was an external enemy, how does that empower us, their children, to be able to overcome the internal Yetzer Hara, which is very, very tricky? So the answer is this. What is so great about overcoming the Yetzer Hara? You see, this is the point. It's not just a matter of there's a distraction and I overcome it, there's a temptation and I don't give in to it, I push myself to do something which I'm not necessarily in the mood of doing. It's not just that I have some kind of strength of self-discipline. It's that if I don't give in to those distractions and temptations, what I'm illustrating is how deeply I'm connected to Hashem. Look how deep the connection is. Even though I am interested in doing something which is bad, I have a desire for it. That desire to do X, which is inappropriate or unhealthy, is not stronger than my desire to remain connected to Hashem. Therefore, I don't give in to the Yetzer Hara. It's an illustration of the fact that I have a deep bond with the Eibishter, deeper even than what seems like an insurmountable attraction. Now, when a person's doing tshuva, that means they've already crossed that threshold and already been in a toxic environment. And now they're doing teshuva, correcting it and coming back. That illustrates that their connection to Hashem is even deeper than the person who stopped themselves from doing the wrong thing in the first place. Here's somebody who failed, who faltered, who did an avera. This person has such an intense connection to Hashem that empowers him to be able to conquer, overcome that negativity, to regret the past and to do teshuvah. That means not only do I have the power to overcome the current temptation and do what the Eibishter wants, but I have the power to reconstitute what I had already done wrong. That would explain how the behaviors and stories of our forefathers actually empower us to be able to stand up to temptation and do teshuvah. Why? Because it's not about the forum of the conflict, it's about the source of the connection that allows me to overcome that conflict. This immense connection to the Eibishter, where no force in the world can weaken that connection. We have that because we've inherited that innate connection from the Avos. Because they were absolutely 24/7, 365. They were vehicles of godliness without any interruption, and that empowers us to have a connection to godliness that can't be interrupted. In the story of the Avos, you would only see this connection express itself when there's an external factor that they have to overcome. But what allows them the opportunity to stand up to those challenges, which is their absolute connection to Hashem at their core, that is what empowers us, that we also are connected at our core to the Eibishter. Therefore, no matter what comes our way, even if it's the stuff our Yetzer Hara throws at us, we can overcome it. We can even do tshuva for it and translate it back into something positive. So now that we've identified that the Avodas Hashem of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov follows these two channels, the Chassid HaMe'ula and the Kovesh HaSitzroi, you expect to see that reflected also in their families, or specifically their descendants. Toldos, they have two kinds of descendants. One descendant that matches the Chassid who's completely attracted only to positivity, and one descendant who is more like the Kovesh HaSitzroi, who is attracted to the wrong stuff and has to learn how to overcome it. Specifically, Vinyonenu, Elam Toldos Yitzchak, Yaakov, Eisav, Amurim B'Parasha. In our case, we're talking here about Yaakov and Eisav as described in the parasha. Yaakov hoya, Ishtam Yoshev Oyalim, Chassid HaMe'ula. Yaakov is the perfect candidate for an elevated chassid. He spends his time learning Torah. He's by nature a tamim. That's the kind of person he is. Whereas Esav's nature is much more rough, much more belligerent. He's naturally a hunter. Like the person has to overcome the Yetzer Hara. You've got to have the Yetzer Hara in order to overcome it. Boy, does he have a Yetzer Hara. And the two characteristics, which are the two ways to serve Hashem, express themselves even before they're born, as they're still developing in the womb. But here there is a distinction. Because while the Avos have the two modes of serving the Eibishter, there is nowhere in their reality a weakness or vulnerability to actually doing something wrong. That's not the case in their descendants. As the name implies, a Tolda is a subcategory. It's a lower version of the Avos and somewhat detached from the Avos. Therefore, there is the possibility that the Kovesh HaSitzroi template could also facilitate actual poor decisions. So as long as these individuals, Yaakov and Eisav, are still the descendants of the children of developing in the holiness of Rivka, then whatever negativity comes into the picture for Esav's channel, which is the channel of Kovesh HaSitzroi, the negativity is only there to facilitate the capacity of Kovesh HaSitzroi. It's not Chas v'Sholem to actually do something wrong. Like the Chazal say, the Eibishter, so to speak, says, I don't know which I prefer. I don't know if I prefer the actions of the wicked or the actions of the righteous, which clearly does not mean that the Eibishter considers even remotely that there's a value in wicked behavior. That would be the strangest thought. How could we entertain even the most hypothetical principle or suggestion that the Eibishter would value and even prefer the behavior of Rishoim? So it doesn't mean Chas v'Sholem that the Eibishter wants the behavior of Rishoim, rather, what it means is that the Eibishter wants the process that the Rasha can achieve, which a tzaddik cannot achieve. The fact that the Rasha could do tshuva, could overcome the Yetzer Hara, could stand up to the negativity. That's what the Eibishter loves about the Rasha, the capacity to overcome, the capacity to transform. Because from the perspective of the Eibishter, where there is no scope for anything negative, the behavior of Rishoim is not the actual bad decisions. Rather, the behavior of the Rishoim is the behavior of the Rishoim correcting the things that they may have done wrong or standing up against those things. And the same thing applies to Eisav. Even while Eisav is developing in the womb, he has a predisposition to Avodah Zarah, because that's the plan. Because that will give him the challenge, and that will allow him to be Kovesh HaSitzroi, and that will allow him to be able to give us the koyach to be able to stand up against our own challenges. So in the womb, his Mashiach to Avodah Zarah is not yet a toxic thing. But then Eisav, the adult who has free choice, he made poor choices, corrupted himself, and detached from Yitzchak. He disconnected from Yitzchak's holiness, and behaved in a way which is contrary to holiness. He took that potential for bad, which is a useful thing to strengthen ourselves, and he turned it into actual bad, which is a toxic thing. That will explain why there's this battle between Yaakov and Eisav over both worlds. That's why they're battling over two worlds. Because which Eisav are we describing over here? We're talking about the Eisav who is still ensconced in the holiness of his mother. He's still in the realm of holiness, and whatever challenges are coming his way are there just to facilitate his growth and his capacity to overcome them. How do they move on? So at that point of his development, if he's fighting to have a chunk of this world, it's because the chunk of this world will help him serve the Eibishter. Because at this point, Eisav is an extension of Yitzchak, an extension of serving the Eibishter. So to understand this better, let's look at one of the key differences between the person who is naturally inclined to the right thing and the person who is naturally inclined to the wrong thing and has to overcome it. The Chosim, which we've described, is somebody who's consistently growing and developing in their spiritual development. Well, then the fixation, interest, the focus of that individual is when you reach the highest level, which is Olam Haba. It's not here. You want a world that is refined. You don't want a world that has the mixture and distractions of negativity. You want a world that's completely holy. And the Chassid HaMe'ula, the Yaakov in the story, that's what he wants. He wants to be able to live in that pristine spiritual world. Whereas the Eisav personality, who has the avoid of being able to confront temptation and overcome it, he sees the tremendous value of actually living as a citizen of this world where such challenges exist so that you can overcome them. Because that's where the real value is. You're going to be challenged, you're going to face concealment, and you're going to overcome it. That's why Yaakov and Eisav in the womb are actually fighting over both worlds. Because neither one of these two means of serving the Eibishter stands alone. There is overlap. Even the person who's this great chassid who's looking to develop themselves spiritually and go from level to level, at the end of the day, knows that you've got to engage with this world. As well as the person who's going to engage the world and transform it, has to plug into holiness and grow in their holiness. Otherwise, how will they be able to tackle the world? That person who's engaging and transforming the world has to step out of the world, even step out of the avodah to transform the world, to transform the world into holiness, and occasionally he has to be in a place of complete holiness. At least at some points, to be completely like a citizen of the tents of Torah. In other words, you want to make an impact on the world, you've got to fill your own cup. You've got to be able to go and invest in Torah learning without any distraction from this world. So then what's the difference between the Chassid HaMe'ula represented by Yaakov, who wants Olam Haba, and the Kovesh Sitzroi represented by Eisav, who wants Olam Hazeh? From Yaakov's perspective, the only reason that a human enters this world and has to live in a physical environment is to gain access to Olam Haba in the best way possible. If you live in this world, you do Torah mitzvahs, you do what the Eibishter wants, that will grant you access to the very highest level of Olam Haba, but the goal is Olam Haba. Whereas the Kovesh Sitzroi perspective, Esav's holy perspective, is the exact opposite. Why is he learning Torah? Why is he divorcing himself on occasion from the world and steeping himself in holiness? To be able to empower himself so that he can make a greater impact on the world. But the ultimate is to impact the world. Therefore, if you're looking through the lens of Yaakov Avinu, the ultimate scholar, what you should choose out of the two worlds, choose Olam Haba and set up the whole of Olam Hazeh to get you there. Eisav is fighting against that idea and saying, no, the most important thing to focus on is your avodah in Olam Hazeh. Because that's going to have the greatest impact, is to be able to transform this world. And whatever you're going to do in the spiritual environment, the so-called Olam Haba, which is represented by Torah learning, that will be to facilitate that you should engage in this world much more. And now we can understand how it is that both the Yalkut Shimoni and the Zohar suggest that when it says the boys grew up, including Eisav, it means that they grew up in spirituality. And that's why the Zohar doesn't only tell us in general terms, but it's quite specific that Avraham Avinu was engaged in the chinuch of Eisav, so he actually got Eisav to do Torah mitzvahs b'poel. Why is that so important? Well, we know that Avram's ultimate thing was to transfer his belief system to his children. We know that Avram Avinu's superpower was to be able to confer to the next generation belief in the Eibishter, dedication to the Eibishter. Therefore, as long as Avram Avinu was alive and a factor in Esav's life, at that point, Eisav overcame his Yetzer Hara and he actually did Torah mitzvahs. And that actually fits with the very next description the Torah gives after Vayigdalu Hanorim, which is that Eisav becomes this hunter at Tzayid. Because at that stage of his life, still plugged into Avram and Yitzchak, that's actually a benefit. To have that ability to be at Tzayid, which we'll see in a moment, means that he's able to manipulate things with what appears to be dishonesty in order to achieve a goal. That's actually positive. Because Eisav is a man of the field, which means somebody invested in the transformation of the physical world to become holy. If you want to be able to overcome all the difficulties and concealment of living in the field and to be able to conquer that world and turn it holy, you have to know how to be a hunter, not in the physical sense of but tzayid befiv. That means that he knows how to say things in such a way that might be a little bit misleading or maybe distracting to the forces of negative. As is explained in multiple places, that if a person really wants to have a proper impact on this world, to transform this world to holiness, you have to do things that appear at least to be a little bit underhand. Yes, as we say in Chassidus, you have to enclothe yourself, invest yourself in the realities of the world in which you live. So in other words, if you're doing shlichus, you may do things that speak to the local culture, not chas v'shalom things which are misaligned with halacha, but you may do things that are going to look like you're very part and parcel of the culture in order to have an impact. Or to just put it into most simplistic terms, the neshama has to engage in physical activities, eating and drinking, etc., which seems to have nothing to do with the neshama or with the purpose of a neshama. What has a neshama got to do with eating? But when you engage in those activities for the Eibishter's sake, that refines and elevates and extracts the holiness that is embedded inside all of these things. That is the perspective of Avram and Yitzchak. If you're still plugged into Avram and Yitzchak, you can do that. You could do things that are a disguise or a misdirection, so that the world doesn't realize you're busy transforming and elevating it. But Eisav does not live with Avram Yitzchak forever. After Avram's influence ceases, and Eisav distances and detaches himself from Yitzchak. Then he becomes the real hunter in the most classical sense, somebody who actually harms other people. So now this explanation, that when it's Eisav still incorporated within the Yitzchak reality, is a positive Eisav. That fits with and can be better understood based on the Alter Rebbe's explanation of why it is that Yitzchak wanted to give the brachas to Eisav. Because the way that Yitzchak saw Eisav was not Eisav as we know Eisav, but rather Eisav as he is in his original pristine spiritual source. When you're looking at Eisav through the lens of his spiritual source, what you will see is the value of engaging the world and transforming and elevating it. Not to be confounded or afraid of the concealment of this world, but rather to have the strength and the gumption to get up there and to actually make a difference to the world and to actually transform the world into positive. That's what Yitzchak saw, and nevertheless the brachas went to Yaakov. Afal b'chein nitna brachas to Yaakov dafka. Why? Because while Eisav has this tremendous potential, it actually lands up being only Yaakov who could make a meaningful difference to our world. Because Yaakov invested in Torah learning, you cannot change the world without the power of Torah. Therefore, you had the power of Torah behind him. That gave him the power to be able to transform the world and turn it into Hashem's home. And Eisav was lacking that because he did not invest in Torah learning. Kovesh Yitzroi is an appropriate and acceptable and authentic path of how you serve the Eibishter. But to do it, you have to plug into Yoshev Oyalim on a consistent basis, and Eisav didn't. That gives us a practical lesson in how we should better serve the Eibishter. Of course, the Yidden are descendants of Yaakov Avinu. We should not mistake that to mean that we're supposed to focus solely on Torah learning. As the Gemara says, a person who claims that they only have Torah, we say we're not so sure that you even have Torah. We also have to engage in the world of the man of the field. Because certainly after the bracha that Yitzchak gave to Yaakov, that avodah of engaging and transforming the world was entrusted to Yaakov and his descendants. You see this alluded to in Rashi's words on the beginning of the parasha, which says, and these are the descendants of Yitzchak. Who are these? Says Rashi, Yaakov and Eisav ha'amurim beparasha. It's Yaakov and Eisav as described in the parasha. Meaning to say, a Jew has to know that we need both channels of how we serve the Eibishter. We need the avodah of Yaakov, which is through Torah and holiness, and the avodah of Eisav, which is through engagement and transformation. But we have to be absolutely clear that we cannot be like Eisav actually was. It's got to be the Eisav in Yitzchak's reality, in the parasha, in an environment of holiness. In other words, an engagement of the world that is guided by and informed by Torah, not just the loose canon of who Eisav became. And you want to actually do that? That's why you have to start first with investment in Torah learning, Yaakov's path. Which by the way Rashi alludes to because he does something really interesting that we might have not noticed. He says, Toldos, Yaakov Eisav Hamorim Beparsha. He puts Yaakov first, even though Eisav was born first, and that's what the Torah is telling us at that particular point. But Rashi puts Yaakov first to tell us our mindset that you have to first have the Yaakov approach and investment in Torah, and only then can you hope to be an Ish Sadeh in a positive way to transform the world. First, you have to be engaged with and dedicated to learning Torah with the sincerity of Yaakov. What does it mean to learn Torah with sincerity? Not to try and distort the Torah to fit our narrative, or to allow the Yetzer Hara to engage with how we learn Torah. But to learn Torah like Yaakov does with the Tmimus, which is, I want to know sincerely, what does the Torah really have to say? What is the emes? Together with that, a person has to know that no person can stay stagnant in their spiritual development. As much as a person may have developed and grown in that sector, which is holiness and dedication to Torah, you've got to step out of that comfort zone and you have to impact the field out there to hunt things of value out of this world and to create delicacies in the plural, as the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, that the two kinds of delicacies, from pure goodness and from goodness that is born out of evil. And that's what we have to do. We have to create that for the Eibishter. Even if that means we have to become a shtickle hunter, which means we have to engage with some of the realities of the world and understand where the world is at. So for example, when you're going to engage with a Jew who's lost out there in the field and disconnected from the Yiddishkeit, and we're trying to reconnect them, you can't speak in Lashon HaKodesh, and you can't even speak in Yeshiva speak. And all of it, you need to speak his vernacular. You have to use metaphors and references that he could relate to. Maybe it's something to do with sport or politics or whatever the case is. And as the Rambam says, the Rambam tells us the way that you educate a person is you first present them with things that relate to their level of maturity or lack thereof, that will appeal to them. You give them nuts, and when they grow older, you offer them shoes. Then you offer the person money and tell him he's going to get honor. In other words, you speak the language of the individual. Because him a gunna, and all of this is really despicable if you actually think about it. But unfortunately, due to people's limitations, that's what you have to offer them. And that's what we have to do. Sometimes dress up in the clothes of Eisav, speak the language of things we really don't care anything about and shouldn't care about, in order to be able to engage with somebody so that they feel comfortable to draw close to Kedusha. Even if right now you're discussing which are his favorite brand of nuts. But you're not doing this in a vacuum. You're doing this coming straight out of an environment of dedication and investment in learning the Eibishter's Torah. Well, if you're invested in Torah, then you're guided by Torah and you're protected by Torah, so that when you engage with the world, it's in a way that's healthy. And you can produce results, which are the kind of results like Yitzchak was able to produce in the parasha, which means even the Eisav is in a holy environment. So if we apply this in our lives, which is the two streams of how we're supposed to serve the Eibishter as descendants of Yitzchak, complete investment in Torah learning and with a seeking of the truth of Torah, so that Torah can guide us, and then using that to go out into the world and speak the language of people so we can engage them, following both streams, that will bring us closer to the time where the Gemara tells us we will call out to Yitzchak as our forefather, which will happen in the ultimate Gula with Mashiach now, because we will have harmonized the worlds of absolute holiness with the world that we live in, and that's ultimately the goal of Mashiach, to bring absolute Elikus into our finite world. Should happen, take it from Yad Mamash.